Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today we're really fortunate to have John Harbour with us. John Harbour is professor emeritus and advisor to the provost at Purdue University. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed some of your previous episodes, so I'm honored and thrilled to be here with you today.
Well, thank you for those kind words. But we look forward to your contribution being on podcasts and also being on the GRCC TV YouTube station. As I start many of these, I'll ask you to reflect on your childhood, maybe your schooling, undergraduate and graduate studies. What sparked your interest in geography initially, and then how did your interests evolve? Would you care to comment for a few moments?
Absolutely. And as you can tell almost immediately from my accent, I didn't grow up here in the US. I grew up in England, just north of London. And as a child, I was fascinated by the outdoors. I loved the outdoors. I loved landscapes. And I was one of those annoying kids who always wanted to know the why and the how things came about. Camping and hiking were my happy place. And I loved lots of different subjects in school. I was interested in the basic sciences, in geography and history and mathematics. And in England, where I grew up, geography was taught as a standard class in the equivalent of middle school and high school. So I was in geography classes on a regular basis from a relatively early age. But in the system I was in at the age of 16, we had to choose 3 subjects for the last 2 years of our schooling. So we had done broad education up to 16, and then we focused on 3 subjects for those last 2 years. And geography was a natural choice for me. I was interested in lots of things, and in geography, I was doing history and economics and physics and mathematics and studying biology. And so geography for me was the way that I could continue to be interested in a wide range of subjects and their interrelationships. So for those 2 years, I studied geography, mathematics, and physics. And so clearly I was sort of heading towards the sort of physical geography side of things. So, my childhood was, I'm first generation, low income. And, one of the things that my mother really emphasized was education as a way to have a much better life. And in fact, she eventually in her 60s got an undergraduate degree through an online university. So she eventually got her chance to get higher education, but that wasn't the reality when I was a young person. And so, she was really emphasizing the importance of doing well in school and then potentially going on to university.
And so you were able to really nurture your interest in geography through your schooling before the undergraduate years. And then
absolutely, and I have very strong memories, in particular, of field work as a high school student. Doing surveys in urban areas and sort of reconstructing sort of different aspects of urban geography, and then going out and doing work in salt marshes and in limestone terrains, and so doing the physical side of things.
So you did both. You crossed you crossed the spectrum of the discipline.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in the UK, you were able to choose where you wanted to pursue university studies in the same manner a student in the US can, or how did that work out for you?
Well, so in the UK, when I was at that stage, you applied to a certain number of universities and you applied to study a major. So I applied to do a bachelor's degree in geography in a geography department where all of my coursework would be in geography. Right? So instead of rather than the sort of broad liberal arts, it was a focused degree program in just the discipline. So I applied to several different universities and was absolutely surprised and thrilled to get admission to Cambridge University to study geography there. It was a struggle. I actually didn't get into the first college that I applied to there. They have a slightly different system. But I was picked up by another college that was looking for more geography students. And so I did my undergraduate there. And that was an astounding experience for me. As a first generation student, I wasn't really sure that I could be successful. I was very nervous about going to university, especially one as well known as Cambridge. And I remember before I went, they sent me a reading list. Here are the things we expect you to have read before you arrive. And since I didn't know any better, I went to the local library and I got all of these things on Interlibrary Loan. I read them all. And when I got to university, I discovered I couldn't find anyone else who'd actually taken it seriously and read this stuff. But it turned out to be an enormous advantage for me. And I had an outstanding mentor, Dr. Jean Grove, who actually had been one of the first female glaciologists in the United Kingdom. Wrote a really fantastic book on the Little Ice Age throughout the world, an amazing scholar and person. And she, nurtured me and other students and really encouraged my interest and built my confidence. The end of my first year, she encouraged me to volunteer as a field assistant for another student who was doing research on a glacier in Norway. And I hadn't had much opportunity to travel before, and so suddenly I'm spending a summer working on a glacier in Norway. And then my second summer, I had to do my own undergraduate research, and with a group of colleagues put together an expedition to the Himalayas. And three of us did our undergraduate research projects together in the Himalayas, one on glacial, one on biogeography, and one on water quality. And that was an astounding experience, just the work together to get the funding. I remember going to the offices of the Royal Geographical Society to interview for funding to support the expedition. So there was that's sort of the history of Britain has a strong sort of expeditionary history related to colonialism, and that's part of the reason that geography is relatively strong there. But it was an enormously, I think, important experience for me to develop leadership skills, to develop confidence, and to collaborate with a wide range of other students to do a fairly challenging field expedition to collect data for our undergraduate dissertations.
Had you had any contact at all with Richard Chorley while you were an undergraduate?
Well, he was one of the lecturers. And I was in awe of Chorley.
As everybody else in the world at the time probably was.
Absolutely.
In the English-speaking world, anyway.
I mean, his work on systems was just, groundbreaking. And I mean, actually, that was part of the joy of being at Cambridge then, is several of the textbooks that I'd read, I'm now listening to lectures by the people who wrote those books, who'd written the key papers in the field. And I remember with Dick Chorley, he always started each lecture with a picture of a cricketer. And so he had an interesting sort of sense of humor. Fantastic individual.
It's interesting. I was just thinking of him. I was wondering who wrote letters of reference for you to go to the RGS to get funding to the Himalayas. And
so, those letters of reference. So in the system there, you had tutors, right? So you were taking a course, and there was the person who was running the course and the lecturer. But in each of the residential colleges, there were faculty who acted as tutors. And so my main tutors were in my college, so Dr. Jean Grove and the lady Adrian at another college. And so those were the people who really knew me well and would write those letters of reference.
Gotcha.
Never got a Dick Chorley letter, unfortunately.
Maybe you got his signature on some piece of paper that you've kept.
Don't think so. No.
Oh, anyway, so there you were at Cambridge, and then later you went to the U.S. to pursue graduate work.
Yeah. So I hadn't, when I chose to go to university, it was to go to university. I hadn't thought about careers and how all of that worked. And as a first-gen student, I really didn't have much idea. And so I relied, strongly on my mentor. And Jean Grove, said to me, look, you're pretty good at this stuff, and you should go to graduate school, which I didn't really know what that was or why you'd do it. But it's like, okay, this sounds good to me. And she said, and you should go internationally. So broaden your horizons, immerse yourself in some other cultures. And so I actually applied to several different countries. But I was particularly interested in the University of Colorado because there was an Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research. So I developed a strong interest in glacial landscapes, quaternary geology, that side of things. And there was a very famous and strong group there at INSTAR, the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, that published a journal that I'd read lots of papers in that journal. And so that was an important opportunity for me. And I knew a couple of people who'd gone there previously, so it felt like a safe choice to go to Colorado. So yeah, I finished my undergraduate degree and then flew into the old Stapleton Airport in Denver and took a bus up to Boulder, Colorado, which was a very different city in those years. But and it was an astoundingly good place to be, a very vibrant geography department across both physical and human geography, as well as an interdisciplinary research institute, which became important in other parts of my work, that brought together people from, biology, physics, mathematics, political science, economics, who were interested in the theme of Arctic and Alpine research. And so it was a good place for me to develop a better understanding of not only geography, but geography in the context of the many other disciplines that many of us work with. So it had a lot of benefits.
And this was quite unlike your experience at Cambridge then, was it not? Or how did it complement it? Because you're giving me the impression that at CU Boulder, there was a high level of interdisciplinarity, whereas maybe in Cambridge, there wasn't as much dialogue among the different disciplines?
There wasn't as much unless you sort it out. So I because of the nature of my interests at Cambridge, I spent a lot of time at the Scott Polar Research Institute, which is sort of like the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research. And so I had already been involved in projects that have worked with people from other disciplines, but I was much more immersed in it at the University of Colorado.
And at the University of Colorado, what was your focus?
So there, I focused on Holocene climate change and its impacts on geomorphology. So I worked up in the Boulder watershed, took lake sediment cores, did mapping of the geomorphology of the watershed, and put together the sort of Holocene changes in climate and the impact that then had on the geomorphology and sediment fluxes. So that was the focus of that piece of research. Very enjoyable, interesting field work. I actually collected sediment cores that I only used part of them, and I actually stored them in freezers at the Research Institute. And 10 years later, I had a student go back and do additional analyses on those cores. So she did work on the fire history of that watershed. So it was a very good experience. I had to learn a lot of new skills, including skiing, because we did winter coring of the lakes through ice, and I didn't know how to ski at that stage. So I had to learn to cross-country ski to do the field work. But I've always been a field scientist. That's my happy place. And so I was able to continue that theme at the University of Colorado. But moving from, I've been doing work on glaciers to a sort of a broader impacts of climate change on geomorphology over long time periods.
And then you finished a master's degree at Boulder, and then you decided to head to the rain shadow side of the Olympic Mountains, I guess, huh?
Well, there was an interesting transition point in there.
Okay.
So the other thing that was an amazing benefit of going to the University of Colorado was I met this amazing person who I've been now married to for many decades. She was a human geographer. And we were going to be a very mature couple. She had actually been offered a job working with FEMA in Washington, D.C., and I had been offered a chance to do a PhD at Cambridge. And so we were going to have this sort of mature distance relationship. And it took a few months apart and her going off somewhere else to go hike. Actually went hiking in Nepal for us to realize that this really wasn't what we wanted to do. So we both sort of put aside our plans and looked for what's the next thing we were going to do. And so I applied for PhD programs in the US in places where it would also work for her. And yes, we ended up in Seattle, Washington, at the University of Washington, which is where I did my PhD in geological sciences. And so my interest didn't change. I was still very interested in geomorphology, physical geography, but because of where the dividing line was between the disciplines at the University of Washington, the people who were doing the work I was interested in were in the geology department, not in the geography department.
It seems to me that at that time, the only individual that had any interest close to yours in geography at UW might have been Zembrunnen, who was doing water resources. And that was about as close as I could think it could get to your interest in geomorphology. Or am I correct?
You're absolutely correct. And interestingly enough, Craig did actually end up on my dissertation committee. But yeah, I mean, the sort of people that I was particularly focused on working with. So again, just like Boulder had INSTAR, University of Washington had the Quaternary Research Center. It was publishing the leading journal in the field at that time. Steve Porter was there, Tom Dunn, Bernard Halle. So a very strong group of people interested in Quaternary geology, geomorphology, glacial studies. But my particular interest was Bernard Halle, who was doing really cutting edge of the applications of physics and mathematics to understanding physical geography processes, geomorphology, glaciology, periglacial geomorphology. And so I was particularly focused on working with someone that just really impressed me, the work that was being published from his group.
Fascinating. And so you earned your PhD, and then you joined the academy. And
not immediately. So I was on a fairly lengthy PhD track, needed to earn some money. So I actually took a step away briefly from my PhD and worked in environmental consulting, which turned out to be a fantastic thing for me to have done. So as background, another person who was sort of key in my experience at the University of Washington was Tom Dunn. Of Dunn and Leopold, and very, very established fluvial geomorphologist. And Tom was teaching a course for planners, water and environmental planning, and I ended up TAing that course. And then he also taught a course in applications of geomorphology and hydrology. And so we did a lot of work in applied geomorphology, applied hydrology, which I had never seen before. I mean, I'd read about it, but I'd never really done it. And that really opened my eyes to the importance of applying what we knew in physical geography to solving real environmental problems, short and medium term. So we worked with communities, we worked with companies, we worked with organizations that needed to have the sort of expertise we had to really plan, to design, to mitigate. And so I then went to work for an environmental engineering company doing that work. And so I spent some time doing erosion control planning and projects and inspection and calculating minimum in-stream flows to support anadromous fish when we were doing small hydro design. So a lot of very applied work that it turns out was really important for me and my students through my academic career. So then I did eventually go back and finish my PhD, got the dissertation in, and then joined Kent State University as my first academic appointment as an assistant professor in geology with a courtesy appointment in geography.
Just a moment, going back to the consulting and this applied geomorphology class, was the greater proportion of effort devoted to fluvial geomorphology in both consulting and in the applied geomorphology for planning class, or was there an equal smattering of areas examined?
So when you think of planning a project, so we ended up working for people who are designing neighborhoods, people who are doing work for forestry companies. Obviously, the water is important, especially in the Pacific Northwest, but it's on stuff. And so landslides, periglacial features, all of that, soil erosion, all of that was extremely important as well. So couldn't have done it without the fluvial, but the
Sure.
other areas of geomorphology were also very important.
It's very interesting, and I had to raise that because I think sometimes the other areas are not treated. They're oftentimes treated as subordinates if they're discussed at all, with reference to those who emphasize fluvial geomorphology. But you
Well,
did.
it's interesting. If you look at the textbooks, then often the stuff that I really focus on, the glacial and sometimes periglacial, is like chapters 13 and 14, the stuff you never quite get to in the course of the semester, right? So,
Sure.
so there is but it's contextual, right? So if you're doing projects up in the mountains, you absolutely are going to do the glacial and the periglacial and landslides and stuff. But if you're on the plains, further south,
Sure.
maybe that's less relevant to you. So, yeah, it's understandable that many of us, when we teach, will use our local environments initially, and so we're going to emphasize that. And then if we do study abroad or education away, then we're going to go to some very different geomorphologies and maybe emphasize those.
Sure. Good point. Good point. So you're at Kent State,
Yep.
and you're teaching a number of courses, still engaged in research, and you like your position as a professor.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed, so I was there as a beginning assistant professor, trying to figure out what I meant to do, right? So we're not really trained how to do this as PhD students typically, but putting together a research program that included both glacial research. So I got some NSF funding to do some work on glaciers in Switzerland, and that was really sort of interesting. It was a good next step from my PhD work. But I also went out into the local community and was looking to develop applied environmental projects. So actually ended up working closely with our local soil and water conservation district and local planners, and developed tools with my students for them to use in environmental management. So I had both my glacial research, more fundamental basic science, and a strong applied program, and about equal numbers of students, maybe a few more in the applied environmental than in the glacial side of things. But also learning to teach, and learning to mentor early career scholars, many of whom actually weren't that much younger than I was, right? So that was an important, growth area for me as a beginning assistant professor.
And over the course of time, you decided to take on leadership roles in the university.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So that happened when I moved to Purdue. So I was at Kent State for 4 years, and then Purdue University, recruited me to move there. As a lot of research ones do, they sort of look around for people who are doing well at maybe regional universities, and they make them an offer they can't really refuse in terms of access to graduate students and facilities. And so I moved to Purdue University and developed my career as an academic there, and fairly quickly ended up leading teams across the university. I seem to have an ability to communicate with people in different disciplines, bring them together, and we started to get success in getting major external funding, then developing research centers and institutes. And from that, I was asked if I would be interested in taking on a role in leadership of my own department, but also of a learning research center, and then subsequently of a global sustainability institute. So I got involved both in the sort of the traditional line leadership, department head, and then further on from that, but also in interdisciplinary initiatives across education and other research themes.
And we've talked before about this, but it would be nice if you'd elaborate on the role that geographers can play in these leadership positions, especially as they pertain to engaging in interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, one of the things that I've discovered, and I encourage other geographers to get involved in this way, is that because of the nature of our training as geographers, at the sort of broad training, our exposure to very different ways of thinking about things through political geography, historical geography, economic geography, physical biogeography, all these different areas, when you bring together people who have disciplinary specialty in history or political science or biology, or that we know enough as geographers not to do their work, but to have reasonable conversations with them, to understand the frameworks that they're coming from, and use that and really be the synthesizers across interdisciplinary, or I like transdisciplinary teams. And so, I've seen geographers at a number of universities sort of rise to the occasion, pulling together colleagues to do work that no one could do on their own, that a single discipline can't achieve. So you have to have, the expertise and the insight from multiple disciplines, but you have to have leaders who celebrate that, who are accessible to the individuals from those other disciplines, and who can make that, that whole bigger than the sum of its parts. And so I've seen, geography as a really good training to prepare people to be effective leaders in that area. But in addition, you've got to have a personality that sort of enjoys doing that enjoys interacting across those disciplines. And I found that leadership training is extremely helpful. So I've been fortunate to go through a number of different programs, helping me understand leadership styles, strategic planning, ways in which you pull groups together, project management, all of the things that, again, are not part of a normal graduate student training, but are really important for that longer term career.
Absolutely. I think they're very important. Myself, I believe that we're wonderful in gaining content knowledge when we complete our degrees. We are enriched by them, but when we move into a department or an agency, unless we have some experience in the area, we're not well versed in leadership. And I've argued that leadership should play an integral role in the curriculum of doctoral programs in the U.S. especially. And geography is a great home for there to be a leadership course. And I would argue transformational leadership should be emphasized. That's my bias on the subject.
And I certainly, fit in with that bias as well, because as I look at the careers of my graduate students as they've gone off into business, industry, higher education, government labs, government agencies, the reality is that their content knowledge as a PhD student or a master's student is really important, but their success throughout their careers requires them to understand and practice good leadership skills and good collaboration skills. And so it's something that, as I put together a graduate group and sort of work to mentor those teams of students, I've integrated into that leadership training, but also encouraged my graduate students to get involved in, at the Purdue campus, we have a mini MBA program for doctoral students in STEM. So a number of my students have done that. I've encouraged them to get involved in the programs we have to help students learn what good teaching and learning looks like. And I'll go off on that theme for just a minute here. So I'd experienced education as a student, for many, many years. I'd sat through large numbers of lectures, and I thought I knew what teaching was because I'd experienced it. One of the wonderful experiences I had at Purdue was I teamed up with a faculty member in the College of Education. We did some projects together. I was the sort of tame scientist, and he was the educator. These are programs aimed at teachers. And so I'm at the back of the room listening to him and observing him and watching what he does. And I'm learning sort of theories of learning and pedagogical approaches. And it's like, why didn't I know this stuff before? It completely changed the way I approached facilitating the learning of students in my courses and in my research group. And I ended up actually having a courtesy appointment in curriculum instruction because I was doing so much with them. But that's another area that we assume that a graduate student in a science discipline in geography will somehow sort of magically know what good teaching is because they've consumed whatever they've consumed. But the reality is we don't. And so it's another area where rich collaboration with colleagues who really know how to do this, who studied it, who've done the research on it, can transform the way we do our work.
Well, indeed. And it seems to me that we can use some more individuals in our discipline that really conduct research in geography education and share the results of their research with the rest of us.
And I would encourage people when they go to the AAG, there's a geography education specialty group.
Yes.
And I gave a presentation in that at the last AAG on some research we'd done on learning. So there is a small but vibrant community in geography education, and there's some wonderful opportunities to get funding to do that style of research. I encourage all of my colleagues, if you're going to do that type of research, team up with the experts in the area. That's not most of our training, but I have wonderful colleagues in education who know the methods, who know the literature, who can really empower the work that we want to do with a specific focus on geography.
I mean, you've been in the ivory tower for years now, and so you might have an idea as to how to forecast future trends. Do you see the specialty of geography education being highly desirable and fundable?
I think it is already highly desirable and fundable, but unfortunately it's not emphasized in many of our departments. And that's not solely a geography problem. That's a problem in many disciplines, is that often the majority of the faculty sort of say, well, yeah, we know how to teach. We've been lecturing for years, and that's how we learn. And so they don't see the need, the impetus to sort of do research in that area. And because it's threatening, because that means we're going to have to change, right? I completely changed the way that I teach because of that exposure. But at the same time, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for funding. It's an opportunity for good scholarship and publications in that. It's an opportunity to do a much better job for our students, to inspire and engage them in new and important ways. So there are a lot of things that will benefit a department and the individual faculty by getting engaged in this work. I actually have a section of my CV, which is Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I've published, not a huge number, but a reasonable number of papers in that area. And have got significant funding in that area at the same time that most people in the field know me for something totally different. So you don't have to abandon one to do the other.
Well, I appreciate your comments because, again, I think these are very valuable to those listeners and viewers that are going to be viewing and listening to this episode. And it can only enhance the status of geography. More students will become interested if we have more effective teaching and learning, more successful learning. Well, so you were at Purdue for a while, and then you decided to go to the Rocky Mountains, I guess.
I did for a little while, yes. So, I had been going through a career that has sort of progressive steps of responsibility, and I was looking around for the next opportunity. I love Purdue. It's been most of my career, but an opportunity came up to apply for the position of provost, chief academic officer at the University of Montana. And my family and I had been going to Montana regularly. My wife's family has a place up in the mountains there.
Missoula's a lovely city, I guess. But
Missoula's a great city right next to Glacier National Park, amazing lifestyle. So, I took a job and was there for a couple of years as the provost at the University of Montana and also affiliated with the geography department there. Wonderful experience, a great place to be. And, an opportunity to help a good institution that needed some change management, worked with a really exciting new president of the university. Did that for 2 years, but then was recruited back to Purdue to work as the provost of Purdue University Global, which is a fully online university for working adults. So a very different challenge, but one which fit some of my previous experience, both in my family, having had online learners, working adults, but also I had been at Purdue running the online education programs for the traditional university. And so a chance to work with the online university for adults was very exciting for me. So did a couple of different provost gigs at very different institutions.
And this this online focus was really, it wasn't necessarily revolutionary in academe, but it was revolutionary in the way that Purdue absorbed a system that was already in place. And
yeah, that's correct. I mean, and especially after COVID, many universities are looking at their online strategy, both some online courses for residential students, but the opportunity to reach a much wider range of learners who won't come to campus, but you could reach with fully online programs. And, I had been involved in that pre-COVID, both at Purdue University and the University of Montana, growing fully online programs to reach larger communities and more diverse communities. But Purdue's strategy of doing an acquisition of a fully online university and rebranding that and turning that into a part of the system, not many universities have done that. I mean, there are a few universities that have had very good online strategies, but many universities have struggled to figure out how to do this.
Mm-hmm. Would you care to comment on some of the challenges that you faced with regard to administering this online behemoth of sorts?
Well, so because it had been built as an online university, so one of the joys, especially in COVID, is suddenly I had no facilities, no buildings, no worrying about how close can the students and the faculty be to each other, all those sorts of things. So there's some big advantages, especially under COVID, to suddenly being in a totally online environment. But it did mean that all the people I worked with were in other places. So all of my direct reports, the deans and the faculty and the staff I worked with, weren't in town with me. And so the entire thing was done through remote connection. So you had to be really good at that. We did actually get together physically at each graduation, and that was the time we'd have a couple of days of retreat. But when you have a community and a culture that has been and optimizes for online, it's nothing like the challenge of when you're a residential place and you're trying to do it quickly. And so, but some of the challenges of a very large online university is scale, right? So you have a large number of instructors distributed across the country. And so the management and supervision of those individuals has to be very carefully worked out, and making sure they're feeling part of a community and the students are feeling part of a community. And there are, again, turns out you can do research on that. And there's been plenty of research on highly effective online communities and online learning. If you bother to read it and then design a university around it, then you get something like we have at Purdue University Global. So some challenges, with everyone online and remote, questions come up in terms of who's really doing the work and identity, the same things that come up with online courses in residential campuses. But again, there are technologies and ways of dealing with that. But I was thrilled to work with that university, and looking at the difference it made for a large number of people who otherwise wouldn't get access. So this one, the average student is some college, no degree, in their 30s or 40s, a larger proportion of traditionally underserved students than you would see at a traditional university, and getting an education that really transformed their lives, in terms of their opportunity to get, much better careers, better paying jobs, and support themselves, their families, and their communities. So a very exciting thing to work on. But as a leader and administrator, they also valued the fact that I hadn't given up my research. Mm-hmm. And so all of my leadership roles, I've thought it was important because, also for my own mental health, but also because I love doing it, but also as an example to others, that I would continue doing small amounts of research while I did that, took on other roles at the universities.
One thing that strikes me about this story, which is a wonderful story, I think, because it provides us with a glimpse of, I think, not the future of higher education so much as, but what's happening now and what probably should be the future in many institutions that are troubled. Do you have any favorite success stories of students that you'd like to share? Those that were able to experience great success after achievement of a degree that maybe they shared with you.
Yeah. So I want to get to the first part of your comment first before I answer that bit. But, there is a lot of concern across American higher education with the so-called demographic cliff. Mm-hmm. I often tell colleagues in geography departments elsewhere, there is no demographic cliff. We have 40 million some college, no degree Americans who desperately need serving. If you're only looking at 18-year-olds, well, yeah, there's a demographic cliff. But if you reposition your lens and look at what is the need is enormous. Our universities don't have the capacity to meet that need, but we can't meet that need by expecting all those people to relocate for 4 years to a residential campus to do a bachelor's degree. Ain't going to happen. And so you've got to be thinking about what is the portfolio of offerings that we provide, and residential is really important. But in addition, we need to be serving other populations, and we can do that highly effectively through really good online and hybrid programs, both domestically and for international students too. So yeah, I've been thrilled to work with a wide range of students and have them share their stories with me. I'm always particularly touched by people who didn't have an opportunity as young people to enter higher education. Mm-hmm. Maybe they went into a service job, or quite a few students at Purdue Global went the military route, and they've had an opportunity to serve our country, to learn some really important skills, and then through articulation of that learning, through credit for prior learning into a Purdue Global degree, for example, have been able, as they transition out of the military, to very quickly get a college degree and use all of that rich learning to get a position that they wouldn't have been able to get previously without a higher education degree. But their military service, for example, plus some higher education is now opening up amazing careers where they can use that skill and knowledge, to serve in corporate America, or to serve at a university, or serve a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly the geographers in the academy need to keep these things in mind. And in my view, we're not acknowledging this fast enough. But that being said, John, we have a minute or two to go here. Yeah. And I'm going to ask you to reflect upon where you've been and think about the words of advice you might give an undergraduate or graduate student who was interested in geography, and also think about some words of advice you might want to give some colleagues in regional university campuses that might be struggling now, as there's a 4% decline in enrollment nationwide in those types of institutions, and maybe other schools as well. Would you care to share some words of wisdom, let's say?
Absolutely. Well, I don't know if they're wisdom, but anyway, I'll share. I guess one of the things I would immediately suggest is get involved with the AAG. That's our disciplines national organization. There are some great regional associations as well. It's been the place throughout my career. It's the one conference I've gone to, I think, almost every year since I came to the US. So it's an extremely important organization. It's where you can find colleagues, friends, mentors, support. So get involved in that. And, I take part in the Healthy Departments Committee, as you do as well. Mm-hmm. And that's another great resource for departments that are looking for ideas for how they can thrive, even though there are projections of declining enrollment from traditional age students. So, and I'll transition to that point as well. If you're at any institution that's worried about enrollments, widen your aperture. Think about working adults in addition to the residential students, and you'll find many wonderful opportunities to work in ways that really benefit your communities and their citizenry. More generally, geography is an amazing and critically important discipline, but it's not well understood in the US by many. So as geographers, we have to be excited and proud of it. And we shouldn't hesitate to educate others about it at every chance. I'm fortunate because of the nature of my research, I've actually been to every continent, and I can give talks illustrated with, the Tibetan Plateau and Antarctica and the Arctic. And so I actually do a talk for high school students titled "How to Get Paid to Go Hiking," to get them excited about, the opportunities in my piece of physical geography. So, you've got, if we aren't talking about geography, no one will. So we've got to be out there talking about it. At your institutions or wherever you end up in business, in industry, in government service, be a leader. As we discussed earlier, geographers are well positioned to synthesize and lead. They see bigger patterns and causes than often people who are in narrow disciplines. Embrace new technologies and approaches. Sometimes we get our job because of a piece, if we're up to speed with the latest cutting edge technology. Maybe you get hired for your GI science skills or your proficiency with AI today, or maybe your online teaching experience if a university is looking for that, and use that as your foot in the door. But then you'll be promoted and lead because you bring so much more with your geography background. And I guess my parting word, for anyone is follow your passions. I can't believe that I've had a career where I've been able to do things that make me so happy and fulfilled, supporting others, doing interesting work. There are amazing opportunities for geographers, and most of us are not aware, what they are. So if you're not aware of the opportunities, go to the AAG career profiles. There are some wonderful examples of the rich things that people do across, many different forms of employment, to apply geography knowledge and learning in really important ways that support our society, our economy, that support humanity. So it's an amazing field, and I encourage you to sort of explore it and find your passion within this amazing discipline.
John, those are profound words, and I think they're very convincing as well, and they're legitimate. I think you have given a great bit of advice to prospective students, but also our colleagues in the field. And I'm sure they will be taken seriously, and they'll help people in our discipline for years to come. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for this opportunity.
It's been wonderful. And this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.